the water crisis in many ways isn't over for Flint. And now what we have is this crisis on top of the Flint water crisis at the same time, essentially. We're still not over one. And now we and the rest of the world are dealing with this other global pandemic. So for the people of Flint, it's one thing on top of another, and it's increasingly difficult to expect people to see a way out of all of this.
Are people relying on bottled water distributions still?
They are. I mean, I think this is one of those situations where it's a bit of a sore spot for a lot of people in Flint, because the water technically does meet the minimal legal definition for clean water under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Most people in Flint still depend on some other source of water for drinking. They'll use the water from the tap for a lot of other purposes, but for immediate human consumption, most people still use bottled water. And there still are efforts, mostly voluntary efforts, to distribute bottled water to the people of Flint.
How are you seeing the effects or the impacts of the water crisis play out in this current crisis?
Well, I think in both cases, the crisis sort of rips the cover off the inequities that we have in our society. But what we're seeing is that in Detroit and in Flint, two places that have high poverty rates and majority minority populations, we're seeing the COVID-19 crisis seem to hit the hardest.
If you could talk about that a little bit more, because you do represent an area, at least in Flint, in the census data I was looking at, it's majority African American.
Right.
Are you hearing from the African American community there about any particular concerns when it comes to coronavirus?
So the concern is that I hear is that a community that is conditioned in some ways to feel marginalized is worried that they'll be marginalized yet again, that the resources that will be broadly delivered across the country won't acknowledge that they are in disproportionate need in a place like Flint. Access to healthcare, access to a health provider, access to good nutrition, access to transportation or high quality education, all of those elements of the society that make it possible for us to come out of the worst circumstances are not present in a place like Flint. So what I've been advocating for, and many of my colleagues disagree, is that this is an inflection point. This is a crisis that rips the cover off some of these inequities. And if somehow we fail to recognize that part of the resolution of this crisis, this is what I hear from my constituents, this is what I hear from the people of Flint. If part of this crisis doesn't right some of the past wrongs and position a community like Flint to be able to navigate whatever the next crisis looks like, it will have been an even worse tragedy. So I think that's what I hear from the sort of thoughtful folks who are calling. Mostly what I hear is fear. People are afraid. They're literally scared to death. And they expect their government to be able to stand up for them and do something. Frankly, because it's a poor place, they're used to not getting all the help that they need. They're fearful, I think, for example, that our public hospital, we have 3 hospitals here in my home community of Flint, but they're fearful that the public hospital, which disproportionately deals with the poorest people, disproportionately deals with higher Medicaid recipients, that they'll be overrun and that there just won't be the help there when they need it. One of the issues that I'm working on is an issue around homelessness. All of our homeless shelters have had to close because the way they're constructed, it's all congregate. There's no possible way to socially distance in a homeless shelter. So these are the sorts of concerns that people have, is that because it's a marginalized community, it's much more difficult for people to do what a lot of folks take for granted, to say to somebody, shelter in place and maintain social distance in a community where people are absolutely dependent upon one another for their own survival is really tough.